We are continuing our series on the heart of worship, which I've said is a series about giving, but really it's a series about worship, and worship is what drives our giving. And we started this series in Genesis chapter 4 with the story of Cain and Abel. And we learned a couple things from that story. One is that we should bring our best and our first fruits to God. But the other thing we learned is that the real reward that God offers is Himself. And He says to Cain in that story that if you do well, will you not be lifted up? And He's talking about his downcast face will be lifted up and experience the joy of the Lord. And then last week we looked at Genesis 22 and Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, or his about to sacrifice of Isaac, his almost sacrifice. And we learned that the God who gives us everything can require anything. The God who gives us everything can require anything, but we also learned that that same God is the God who meets our deepest needs in Christ. And this morning, we come to the book of Exodus, and we're going to be covering kind of a big story in Exodus. And the whole point of the story is whether or not we trust God to be God for us. And there's kind of a negative example and a positive example. I saw something this week on things that persuade us. And one of the things that they said as far as things that persuade us is that we're persuaded by the very first things we hear, by our very first impressions. So in this thing that I saw, they had two twin sisters, two women, come in and interview for a job. And they said the same things as they interviewed for the job, but they said them in a different order. And they also said it with different body language. So the first person came in and they said, well, the interviewer asked them, and the interviewer was just a mock interviewer, but they did not know that they were interviewing two twin sisters when they started this process. And they asked the person, why should I hire you? And the first person said, I'm hardworking, I'm creative, and I'm a self-starter, I go after things. And they said that with a smile on their face. And then they said, but I'm also nitpicky and brutally honest and sometimes a little bit lazy or something like that. And you think, wow, who would ever say that in a job interview, right? And then that was kind of the end of what you saw. And then the next person came in and they said, well, I'm nitpicky, I'm brutally honest, sometimes I don't work very hard, but I'm also creative and hard work, self-starter, I don't know, they said some other things that were the same thing, but they said it in reverse order. And then they asked the people who were interviewing them, they had like 10 people do this with the same two people. They said, who would you hire? And they said, well, the first one. They said, yeah, but they said the same things. Yeah, but the first one said the positive things first. And one of the things they figured out about our brains is that we listen, when people are giving us a list, we listen to the first few things and make our decision, and then there's almost a switch that doesn't hear the rest of things, which maybe that says more about how we listen than about interviewing for a job. But it also shows us that things that are positive make a good first impression. The problem with the story I'm about to tell you is that it begins with a negative story and then ends with a positive story. At least that's how it appears. But I'm going to show you that it's really bracketed by two positives, and in the middle is a negative. So stay with me. We're in Exodus, and it's one of the most famous stories in Exodus, the golden calf. Do you remember that, where they make the golden calf? But it starts long before we get to the golden calf. In fact, about 40 days before we get to the golden calf. We see at the end of Exodus chapter 24, we see this. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the mountaintop in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Before I go any further, you should know that Moses has already given the book of the covenant to the people. In other words, he has read aloud to them the 10 commandments and then the essential parts of the covenant already, and they have said, yes, we will do those things. And then Moses, with God's instruction, invites the 70 elders along with Aaron and his sons up, and they have a banquet in God's presence. Do you remember this? And they can see kind of like the footstool of God's throne with, it says it looks like sapphire. And after that, after all this has happened, Moses goes up on the mountain and disappears into the cloud, if you will, the cloud of glory. And he's up there for 40 days and 40 nights. And now what God is saying to Moses is he begins to give him the instructions for the tabernacle. And it starts in chapter 25. You can see that. And this then is the agenda for the rest of the book of Exodus. That the whole purpose of the book of Exodus is God calling a people out of Egypt for himself, and that's like the first 15 chapters, right? And we think of the story of the plagues and all that as being the bulk of Exodus, but then we go on for like another 20 chapters, and it's all about God forming this people for himself and then making a way so that he can live right in the middle of them so that they can worship and enjoy him. And the way he's going to do that is by giving them the tabernacle. And so he begins to give Moses instructions for the tabernacle. And notice what he says here. I just want you to see this, that it's all the way back in chapter 25. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel that they take for me a contribution. From every man whose heart moves him, you shall receive a contribution for me. And this is the contribution that you shall receive from them: gold, silver, and bronze, blue and purple and scarlet yarns, and fine twined linen, goat's hair, tanned ram skins, goat skins, acacia wood, oil for the lamps, spices for the anointing oil, and for the fragrant incense, onyx stones and stones for a setting, for the ephod and for the breastpiece. And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst." So you see God's purpose here, right? They should give. Whoever's heart moves him should give, and you'll make a sanctuary so that I can dwell in your midst. Well, that's the starting with the good news. Then it moves very quickly, beginning in chapter 32. And by the way, all of the chapters leading up to this have just been God's instructions for the tabernacle and how Moses should build the tabernacle. Then in verse 32, Moses has been up there for 40 days, or chapter 32, for 40 days and 40 nights. And you know this story because many of you heard it in Sunday school, but I want you to read it because it's painful and you should feel the pain of this. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said, and the verb there, gathered themselves together, you might put in gathered together against. There's a debate over what the word means, but they're coming at Aaron like a mob here. And they say to him, "Up! Make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, notice how it's not Aaron who says this yet. It's they say it, the people say, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh." Now, if that surprises you right there, it should. Aaron is now saying that this calf represents Yahweh. And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, most of you who are familiar with this story know that God has expressly commanded them that they shall have no other gods before him, that they shall not make for themselves any graven image, the very thing that Aaron has done here. And then in the book of the covenant, which has already been read to them, he says that if you make an offering to any other god besides me, or any graven image besides me, in fact, if you offer burnt offerings or peace offerings are fellowship offerings that show covenant relationship. If you offer those things to any other god, you shall be devoted to destruction, meaning game over. They had already heard this, and they did this, and Aaron was leading them, and you think, what in the world were they thinking? I will say this, that their actions are motivated in some way by fear. Did you catch that in the passage? They don't know what has become of Moses. And they've probably started trusting in Moses too much as the mediator and the person that God has set up as their deliverer, and not quite trusted in Yahweh enough. And then they come up with this idea, or at least Aaron does, of a golden calf. And you wonder, where did he come up with that? I noticed in Ben's children's bulletin, he said that it was a female goddess in Egypt, but there was actually a male god who was represented by a young bull in Egypt called Apis or Hapis. And we don't know all the reasons for it, but for whatever reason, these Israelites who are not too far removed from Egypt have decided that they're going to mix the worship of the young bull that they saw in Egypt with the worship of Yahweh, the one true God. And the reason they're doing it is they're afraid. They don't know what's become or what's happened to Moses. So I want to start to draw some principles out of this for you and for me. And the first thing I'll say is that we're going to see a contrast in these next chapters between fear-based worship and joy-based worship. Fear-based worship and joy-based worship. And I want to just make some observations here. The first one is that fear-based worship worries that God is not in control, that somehow God has lost the ability to handle things. You see that? It's subtle, but it's there, I believe, that the people of Israel say, we don't know what's become of Moses. Therefore, they don't think we should just trust God. They think we should take matters into our own hands. God is obviously not handling things. He can't control things. So fear-based worship worries that God is not in control. It also, and again, this is a little bit of a stretch from the passage, but fear-based worship gives the minimum that's required. Do you notice how Aaron asked for their earrings from their sons and daughters and wives, and so they all take out their earrings and give that to him, and he melts it down and makes it into this golden calf. And we don't know exactly how that process worked. Many commentators have suspected that this was a wooden model that then Aaron plated with the gold. We're not sure. The other thing you see with fear-based worship is that it syncretizes, that's a big word, it melds or it meshes with the world. It decides to take something worldly and try to mesh it or make it work with the worship of God. And then finally, fear-based worship worships its own version of God with a view to its own security and pleasure. It worships its own version of God with a view to its own security and pleasure. They're worried about what's going to happen to them. They make a god. And they say, this is the God that brought us up out of Egypt. This is the God who delivered us. Now we have a God we can trust in. And then they rise up to eat and to play. And the Lord says to Moses in the very next verse, go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. If you want to look at it, Psalm 106 makes a comment about this. And Psalm 106 says that when they made this golden calf, they forgot the God who saved them. When they made this golden calf, they forgot the God who saved them. So you don't think they forgot it because they said, these are your gods who saved you. But in other words, they're turning their back on God's great deliverance. They're forgetting about it and taking matters into their own hands. Moses prays for the people and he turns from destroying them. And he prays and says, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and made these covenant promises to them. And verse 14 says, the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. So Moses goes down and Joshua says, I hear the sound of singing. I don't know what's going on. And when they get down there, did I miss something there? Hold on. Yeah, I want to read the end of there. Verse 19, as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, remember, God has already told Moses what happened. Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf they had made, burned it with fire, ground it into powder, and scattered it on the water and made the people drink of it. Now, if you wanted to draw out another principle from this, it would be a little bit of a stretch, but remember how precious water was to them in this setting, and that God had provided water for them there at Mount Sinai, and he caused the rock to split open, and we guessed that like a spring was flowing out. And so the very thing that was their life, if you will, physically speaking, now he throws this gold dust in the water and makes them drink of it. And so the offering that they gave, if you want to stretch it a little bit, is totally wasted, isn't it? Fear-based worship is wasted worship. They've tried to take matters into their own hands. They've tried to call something God that wasn't God. They've tried to handle things themselves, and it was all futile. I'm about to play a video up there, Miles, and so I want you to be ready for that because you may have to adjust the volume on the board for the PC. Before I play this video, I want to say a comment. Some of you might have seen it on my Facebook page, and my intent now is not to offend you. But I don't know if you've noticed, but we're in an election year. Some of you may have seen headlines and such. And I'll be honest with you, when I personally look at things, it's very disheartening to me. From about every single possible angle you could look at it, it's disheartening to me. But I also know that nothing has happened to God's position on his throne. Right? Nothing could ever change that. And God is not surprised or astounded by things. And I realize also that maybe I have a tendency to put my hope too much in my own safety and security and pleasure. And so I worry about these things perhaps a little too much, and I don't trust God enough. And we have a tendency, and this is where I don't want to offend you, where we try to take politics and make it Christian or not Christian. You know what I mean? Like if you can't vote for this candidate, but if you're a Christian, you'll vote for this candidate or something like that. And of course, this year, who knows what our choices are. But I want to play this video for you. This is Andy Stanley speaking, and I don't know if you'll have to turn it up or down, Miles, but I hope you'll get the humor of this, but also the heart of it. Oh, let's see.
Now, real quick, I want to say something to a couple groups, all right? First, I want to say something to all of you who are 45 years old and older. You don't have to raise your hand, okay? 45 and older. Look up here. Many of you have grown weary and you've lost heart. And the reason is because you have fixed your eyes on a political system. You have fixed your eyes on a political leader. You have fixed your eyes on the good old days. You fixed your eyes on the economy, and you are growing weary, and you need to knock it off. And I'll tell you why. Because you are scaring the children. You are. Now look up here, look. The generation that's coming along behind us are going to take their cue from us. And here's the cue we're giving them. Oh my goodness, if we don't get the right person elected in office, it's the end of the world. If we don't fix the economy, it's the end of the world. If we don't have religious freedom like my mama and my grandmama had religious freedom, it's the end of the world. Oh my goodness, if we don't get the right laws passed, if we don't have the right policies, it's all coming unraveled. Nothing could be further from the truth. Look up here. Government matters, policies matter, but neither of those matter as much as men and women who understand this word. Faith. Confidence that God keeps his promises and that nothing can thwart the plans of God. We know this from the Old Testament. We know this from the New Testament. We know this because the most powerful person in Judea, Pilate, looked at Jesus and said, "What is truth? Crucify him. Game over. It's done. Let's move on." And the only reason you know who Pilate is, the only reason you know who Pilate is because you know the story of Jesus. Pilate, the governor, becomes a footnote in the story of Jesus. In fact, most of the first century people you know about because they're part of the story of Jesus. We have nothing to fear. So all of you people over 45, knock it off. You need to model for the next generation that God is in control. God can be trusted. Get involved in the political system. Get involved in culture. Get involved in your society. But you never fix your eyes there. You fix your eyes on Jesus.
Now, I'm not 45 yet, but I'm close. But that speaks to me. And I realize that when I get nervous about things, then I think, I'm watching polls and I'm watching elections or primaries and caucuses, and I'm trying to figure things out, and I'm trying to think of a way that this can work out so that I'll be okay. I think, what am I doing? I need to fix my eyes on Jesus, and He has the whole thing under control, and He might be working out a great and glorious plan that is far beyond our imagining. It may just not look like we think it will. The Israelites made this fatal mistake, and I skipped past the passage as getting to the video, but their fatal mistake was taking matters into their own hands because of fear and trying to mesh the worship of the one true God with the worship of this golden calf that they had known about from Egypt. And then Moses, it says in the passage that the people had broken loose, and we don't know what that means. Some versions say that there was revelry going on. We don't know exactly, but probably some kind of drunken revelry is what we think is happening. And Moses says, all those who are for the Lord come to be with me. And the Levites all come to him. He says, strap on your swords. And they go through and they kill 3,000 men who have grieved the Lord by their sin. By the way, for perspective, we learn later that there are over 600,000 men in Israel when they're numbered at this point. So this is like what is that? 0.5%. But it's a significant number of people who have grieved the Lord with their sin. So what's the contrast to this? I wanted to show you I didn't want to start with the negative because I thought that's all they'll remember. I want to show them the positive. What's the difference between fear-based worship and joy-based worship? And we get, this is kind of a transition passage in Exodus 33 here, and then we're going to jump forward to Exodus 35. The Lord said to Moses, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it." And then God makes this fascinating pronouncement. He says, "I will send an angel before you." Do you see that right there? And he says, "I'll drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." So here's what's changed now since the golden calf. God was giving Moses instructions for the sanctuary so that he could dwell right in the middle of them as they went to the promised land and then as they worshiped him in the promised land. That was happening all the way back in chapter 25. But here God says, "You take them, Moses, and I'll send an angel in front of you, and all the promises of the land and driving out all the people before you, that'll all still happen, but I am not going to go up among you." And it says this in verse 4, when the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments. If I can reread that for you and notice the irony here. No one put on their earrings. For the Lord had said to Moses, the reason they were mourning, "Say to the people of Israel, you're a stiff-necked people. If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. So now take off your ornaments that I may know what to do with you." Therefore, the people of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments from Mount Horeb onward. Those who worship the Lord with a pure heart are not concerned about status. And these ornaments were carryovers. They were things that the Egyptians gave them on their way out of town. Remember that? The Egyptians gave them all their wealth, saying, "Leave, leave, leave, please leave us." And they had all these Egyptian earrings and ornaments and stuff, and they were decorating themselves with it, and they were gaining status from that, and they realized none of that matters because we want the Lord to go with us. We don't care about our earrings anymore. We don't care about our status. If God doesn't go with us, why are we even going? And so I'm leaving out a huge chunk of the story here, but the very next section in Exodus 33 and 34 is one of the most central passages in all of Scripture where Moses implores the Lord and said, "If you don't go with us, don't send us." And Moses says to the Lord, "Show me your glory." And the Lord passes before him, you remember, and he hides him in the cleft of the rock, and he proclaims his name in front of Moses. He says, "I'm the Lord, a gracious and compassionate God." And you remember that. The Lord proclaims himself to Moses. And God listens to Moses and decides to go up with them. And so then we get to Exodus 35. And Moses said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, verse 4, "This is the thing that the Lord has commanded. Take from among you a contribution to the Lord. Whoever is of a generous heart, let him bring the Lord's contribution." And then he asked for the skilled craftsmen in verse 10. And he's identified some of the craftsmen that he wants to build the temple, by the way. And I don't know if this has a direct parallel today, but yesterday we had a work day, and they knew that I'm not very good at anything, so they asked me to paint a door with Debbie Best's supervision. And so that's what I did. But we had skilled laborers here, and they were working. And there's some walls going up over there for the bathroom and the shelter house, and there's a border on the playground and some other things happening. And I was so thankful for that God provides what is needed for His people. So if you were a part of yesterday's workday, thank you. But I want to say even more than that in this passage we see all the people coming together to provide for God's sanctuary. And all of you are part of that here at Living Water. You're part of the body here who provides for what God is doing. And I'll say more about that in just a little bit. Verse 20, I'm going to pick it up. Then all the congregation, right in the middle, then all the congregation of the people of Israel departed from the presence of Moses, and they came, everyone whose heart stirred him, and everyone whose spirit moved him, and brought the Lord's contribution to be used for the tent of meeting, and for all its service, and for the holy garments. So they came, both men and women, all who were of a willing heart, brought brooches and earrings and signet rings and armlets, all sorts of gold objects, every man dedicating an offering of gold to the Lord. And everyone who possessed blue or purple or scarlet yarns or fine linen or goat's hair, everyone started bringing what they had. Finally, verse 29, all the men and women, the people of Israel, whose heart moved them to bring anything for the work of the Lord that was commanded by Moses to be done, brought it as a free will offering to the Lord. In fact, they brought so much. You find in chapter 36 that Bezalel and Aholiab said to Moses, there's too much. Every day they kept bringing free will offerings, verse 3 says, every morning. So that the craftsmen who were doing every sort of task on the sanctuary came, each from the task he was doing, and said to Moses, the people bring much more than enough for doing the work that the Lord has commanded us to do. So Moses gave command, and word was proclaimed throughout the camp, let no man or woman do anything more for the contribution for the sanctuary. So the people were restrained from bringing more, for the material they had was sufficient to do all the work and more. Can you believe that? They said, don't bring any more. They said there's more than enough. In fact, if you read on, you'll find that there were over 2,000, I got to get this right, hold on. 2,000 pounds of gold and over 7,500 pounds of silver given to the building of the sanctuary, not to mention the animal skins and the yarn and the thread and all of that. By the way, this is a side note. This has nothing to do with the sermon, but they were supposed to put pomegranates on the robe of the priest, and they were supposed to be these red and blue and purple pomegranates. And we don't exactly know what they were doing, but Francis Schaeffer said that God is a creative God because He commanded them to put pomegranates on the robes of the priests that did not exist in nature. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's fascinating to me that God would specify that to be put on the robes of the priests. That's a side note and speaks to our artistic and creative God. So the difference between fear-based worship and joy-based worship is that joy-based worship trusts that God is in control, that somehow He hasn't stopped being on the throne. So much so that they could give the best of what they have and keep on giving. This is a free will offering. God said whoever's heart moves them, they should give. And they gave with a generous heart. A joy-based worship gives as much as it can. That's very different from fear-based worship, which wants to know what's the minimum amount required. Pastor Ben mentioned doing taxes earlier. And I don't know about you, but when I'm doing my taxes, I don't think to myself, oh, nuts, I wish I could have given more. In fact, I have just the opposite feeling about it. I think, what is the minimum I can give? Right? What is the minimum I have to give to the government? That's not because I think that everything the government is doing is wrong, by the way. That's just because I'm selfish and want to keep as much of that for myself as I can. But there's a difference between fear-based giving, and by the way, the reason I give to the to the IRS, first of all, is because I want to be a person of honesty and integrity, and also because there's a little bit of fear there. I don't know about you, but I think, who's going to be knocking on my door? Have you ever gotten a letter from the IRS? I got a letter once, and it was just to do with, like, I don't know if it was a slight underpayment or overpayment. It wasn't a big deal, but just seeing that on the envelope made my heart go dum 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 dum. What's going to be in that letter? Joy-based worship gives as much as it possibly can. It worships God alone from the heart. The people were distraught that God might not go with them. And now that He is going with them and His tabernacle is going to be in their midst, they give freely and generously. And then tied right into that is that they seek God, the one true God, for the sake of getting God Himself. Have you thought about that? Why would you give so generously to a tabernacle? Because a tabernacle is where God is going to live, right in your midst. So how do you move from fear-based worship to joy-based worship? And the only thing I could come up with, the more I thought about this, was one word: trust. Trust. There was something that happened to me this week, and I cannot tell you any of the details, so that means this illustration is not going to work for that reason. But something that happened where I just kept being tempted not to trust and to take matters into my own hands. And I would pray about it, and as I prayed, I sensed the Lord very clearly telling me not to take matters into my own hands, but to trust. And I thought, Lord, you don't, easy for you to say, God, but this thing needs to be handled now. And God said, wait, trust. And I wish I could stand up here and tell you that I waited and I trusted and God worked everything out and that weight has been lifted. But I'm still, right now, as I'm preaching to you, and I thought, Lord, why do I have to preach this sermon today? Because He said, wait, trust. I said, no, I can handle this. I've got a way. I can do it. Wait, trust. And the only way you move from fear-based worship, where you take matters into your own hands, to joy-based worship, where you worship with open hands, is trust. Don't fix your eyes on the problem, as some have said, but fix your eyes on Jesus. Trust that God has it under control, that God is still on the throne, that He knows your need, and He is able to handle it. I want to invite the worship team forward, and we're just going to sing together one more time. I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene. Earlier I said, after Phyllis came up to speak with me for just a moment, that there's someone here who has maybe lost hope, cannot see the light at the end of the tunnel. When she was saying that to me, I thought, is that me, Lord? Maybe it was, but I have a feeling that it was one of you too, at least. And we stand in the presence of a great God who loved us by giving us His one and only Son. And if He would give us Jesus, Romans 8 says, how will He not along with Him graciously give us all things?